Hi everyone, welcome to today's Roots to Shoots webinar. Today is June 5th and we are joined by Jeff Palmer, the Upper Midwest Regional Technical Manager from Arborjet. Jeff is a wealth of knowledge and we're looking forward to hearing him speak on Japanese beetle and management options. There is an ISA credit at the end of the lecture, so hang on for that last slide to get your credit number. And as for that, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Actually, it's morning everywhere, I think. I'm in Minnesota. It's a beautiful day. After a long winter, we've had a nice rush into spring, and so Japanese beetles are maturing as we speak. We're going to talk a little bit about Japanese beetle. I know that for some of us, it's been around a long time, and it's kind of old news. For others, it's just kind of on the horizon, and it's kind of new to us. So there's people from all over the country on the webinar, and so I'm going to talk in fairly general terms. It's going to be, there's more specifics involved. If you're, say, in Florida or Georgia, your timing is going to be a little bit earlier than if you're in Minnesota up here or Wisconsin. Also, I'm going to talk mainly about the adult stage and controlling the adult stage. I'll touch briefly on the larval stage that affects turf, but as you know, we are Arborjet, and kind of our business has been trees. We do have products that do treat turf as well, but primarily we're in the tree business, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the tree and ornamental issue, which is the adult portion of the life cycle of the insect. So with that, I'll get going. One second. There we go. So adult Japanese beetle there on the left, and the juvenile, of course, are the larvae. Adults affect the trees, trees and ornamentals. The larvae affect the turf, and both the adults and the larvae are active during the summertime. This is an exotic invasive insect. In other words, it was introduced to our country like many problematic pests. This one was introduced. It originally was discovered in New Jersey about 100 years ago in 1916. And so, as I said, the Northeast has been dealing with this for a long time, but it is slowly moving across the country and causing problems. I read that it was a $450 million landscape ornamental issue. In other words, it cost us $450 million to manage this pest. And so it's becoming a bigger issue for people in the western United States. Again, native to Japan, introduced and identified in the United States in 2016 in New Jersey, was introduced as in the larval stage as grubs in iris bulbs, and then spreading slowly across the west through the U.S. It is still a managed or regulated pest through the United States Department of Agriculture, APHIS. They still are trying to manage the movement and the spread of this pest because it is such a costly, not just for ornamentals, but also crop pest. And so you can kind of see that it's relegated to the eastern United States as far as we know it's there. It's going to be there forever, not going to be eradicated, but there are still some areas in western United States where it's spotty and attempts are being made to eradicate the pest. And this map here kind of shows that. So the purple areas are very well established Japanese beetle. We know that that's been there a long time and it's not going anywhere, and so we just have to manage it. Some of the peripheral areas, say if it's a yellow county, you see a lot of those in Nebraska, South Dakota, in Arkansas, Mississippi. That's where we have found the pest, and in fact, I'm just looking at one of these yellow counties, and that's where the city of Omaha is. And last year, Japanese beetle was really severe in Omaha, and so it's not just been found; it's fairly established. However, it's not to the consensus establishment. In other words, it's not everywhere all the time. So again, there's efforts being made to try to limit the movement of this pest through plant materials, and also through air travel to the far western United States, where it has been found in places like California, Oregon, Washington. But again, the USDA is actively managing it, trying to eradicate it in certain areas. If they do find it in a county that's kind of an outlier, they'll do their best to eradicate it. But generally speaking, it is slowly becoming established from east to west throughout the United States. And again, there's another map of that whole distribution. As I mentioned, Omaha, Nebraska was severe last year. I would say that I couldn't find it anywhere west of Omaha, maybe a little bit in Lincoln, but so those states that are just kind of on the edge are just now becoming, let's say, infested, generally infested, and right now they're called partial infestations. And again, to the south, it's a similar scenario. The life cycle of Japanese beetle. So in the, let's start from now because it's June, and right now the adults are beginning to emerge in the south, and they will be emerging in the north here fairly shortly. And they burrow out of the soil and as an adult, and they'll fly around and mate and do their damage, and then the females lay eggs into the soil, back into the soil in the ground. And then new larvae start to develop in this, in a couple weeks, 2, 3, 4 weeks in the south, a little bit longer in the north. And the young larvae start to develop, and they feed on the roots and organic matter of turf. And so they're quite damaging to turf, both as young larvae and then next spring again as older larvae. And then they'll go through their different instars throughout the rest of the summer. As it gets later in the year and it gets cooler, they will go burrow much deeper into the soil, 4 to 8 inches down into the soil, and overwinter as a larva deep in the soil. As the spring warms up, the larvae begin to get active again and move back up into the root zone area and begin feeding again, and then they pupate into an adult and emerge again this time of the year and a little bit later. So I thought it was a real timely time for this webinar to talk about the damage that adults do, because in the next, from now in the south till through August in the north, you're going to see damage from the adult insects on ornamental plants. And so the other stages are damaging to the turf, and that's through young larvae late summer and through older larvae in the spring. Generally speaking, it is a one-year life cycle, meaning that it takes 1 year to complete its life cycle from a larva to an adult. However, in colder climates, it actually can take 2 years to complete its life cycle as a larva and emerge as an adult. And the larva stage does do damage to turf. Again, they feed on the lower roots and the rhizomes and organic matter in that area. And if there's enough of a population of those insects, they will cause substantial damage. Oftentimes around here you can see where turf areas are loaded with grubs, because animals will go dig them up. Raccoons and skunks and things like that will go dig them up to get the food, the grubs underneath the soil. And Japanese beetle grubs are only one type of insect that causes damage to turf. So if you do see insect damage to turf, it's not a guarantee that it's a Japanese beetle grub. It could be another white grub, or it could actually be other insects, sod webworms, things like that are causing damage to the turf. But this is a typical indication of grub damage mid to late summer, after those young larvae are starting to feed, and so then that's when you'll see the animal activity start to dig up that turf area to try to look for those grubs. Again, I'm not going to talk an awful lot about controlling in the turf stage, in the larval stage. There's a lot of information out there for you to grab, but I am just going to touch on a couple of control methods that you might undertake. One other thing I wanted to point out, that weather does impact the life cycle of this insect. They do overwinter as larvae 4 to 8 inches in the soil. If you're in the south, that's not going to be a problem as far as temperature. 4 to 8 inches down, it's generally pretty uniform in temperature. But in the north, these insects are susceptible to mortality once that area becomes 25 degrees or lower. And they will try to burrow deeper down. But if we have what we call an open winter up here, in other words, there's not a lot of snow cover to insulate the ground, then you can have pretty severe temperatures down in that soil level. And so that can cause mortality to the larval stage. And in fact, this past year, it did get quite cold in December before there was a lot of snowfall. And so that could affect areas that had a lot of Japanese beetle damage last year. That could affect some of the grubs for this upcoming year. And so if there's a message about Japanese beetle, it is difficult to predict populations. And so last year, say in Iowa, for example, was a heavy, heavy population of insects. If they did have some mortality over the winter, it might not be as heavy of a population next year. So difficult to predict. The weather does have an impact. And then again, once the females are laying eggs and the larvae start to hatch, dry conditions during the summer can limit their survivability as well. And so if you have a drought conditions when they're laying their eggs in the turf and there's not a lot of live turf growing, that can affect their populations as well. So again, this is the only slide I'm going to have on turf grub control. There's several ways to manage white grubs or Japanese beetle grubs in the soil. There's cultural control, and one of the ways you can manage that is if you, excuse me, are in a dry climate and you're non-irrigated turf. If you don't irrigate and it's dormant turf, it's difficult for those insects to survive. There's biological control. Bacillus thuringiensis is a biological control for many different insects, and the one for Japanese beetle happens to target that larval stage as well. Milky spore disease. There's nematodes that are parasitic against the larval stage as well. And then, of course, there's chemical control. And lots of different several different active ingredients that we'll either target as a preventative if we're doing in the springtime as a preventative for insects that are about to feed. The difficulty with that is predicting if that's going to be a high population or low population by need to treat. Then there's also curative controls. Curative controls will, I'm getting some feedback, so I'm going to pick up my phone. Curative controls are later in the season that if you do target areas that do have damage, then you're going to be able to curatively control that. Again, we don't deal a lot with these types of treatments at Arborjet, and I'm going to leave that to the turf experts, but I'm going to focus mainly on the adult stages of control. So the adult stage, again, difficult to predict when populations will be high, so we want to monitor to determine if there's going to be plant damaging thresholds. So that's a typical integrated pest management strategy, is that we employ control methods when we know that there's going to be damage. And it's difficult with Japanese beetle because just because it was bad last year it's not 100% slam dunk that it's going to be bad this year. So there's several different traps out on the market that you can monitor. Certainly following growing degree days, in other words, knowing when the insects are active, and almost to the day in Minnesota or I would say southern Minnesota or southern Wisconsin, Japanese beetle adults generally emerge around the 1st of July. And that's been a pretty reliable date. However, temperatures can affect that. That can accelerate the development of the maturation of the insect. And so they generally begin emergence at 1,030 growing degree days, base 50. In other words, if it's 80 degrees for a high and 60 degrees for a low, that's a 70-degree average temperature. You subtract 50, and that means that day you got 20 growing degree days. And so you accumulate all those growing degree days, and once you get around 1,030, that is when they begin to emerge, and then they continue to emerge through 2,150 growing degree days. Just read a post in Iowa, and you look on the right side there, that's basically a growing degree calculator, so that assembles all the growing degree days for every latitude. And in Iowa, they were predicting that Friday or Saturday of this upcoming week, they will reach 1,030 growing degree days in central Iowa. I think it's a little early yet for Japanese beetle to emerge, but it's possible that next week you might see some emergence in Iowa. Whereas down south, you've probably already accumulated that kind of growing degree number, and so it's likely that the adults have already begun emerging. So knowing our growing degree days, knowing when the historical emergence of the adults are out, it helps us to target our treatments at the right time of the year. So damage generally occurs up to a couple months after these adults begin to emerge. They can live longer than 60 days, but that is a pretty typical number 45 to 60 days on average is when you're going to see that peak damage that the adults are causing. So if they emerge on July 1st, you're going to see damage through the middle of August, certainly, and to the end of August. In the north and down south, that's going to start a little earlier and probably end a little bit earlier, too. So the damage that they cause, it's a skeletonizing insect. I like the picture on the left because it actually shows apple scab disease and the damage of the insect, Japanese beetle. But that's a favorite plant of theirs, the crabapple. They also like river birch and linden, the other two pictures. So those are some tree species that they like. They like a lot of different ornamentals too, and trees, shrubs, and perennials, and annual flowers, crops. Certainly soybeans are a target of this insect. And what they do is they'll skeletonize and eat all the, basically all the chlorophyll-filled tissue and leave kind of the veins, and that causes that skeletonized appearance. So the tree on the right has basically been entirely fed on. There's really not any food-producing tissue left on that tree, and that was probably mid-July. By mid-July, a small linden tree could be totally defoliated or skeletonized to the point where it's not producing food. And so you can see it's not just an ornamental issue, it can actually be quite damaging to the tree. If that happens year after year, that's going to put a stress on that tree. So when you compare it to an insect like emerald ash borer, that's 100% lethal, kills the tree when the populations build up, to a Japanese beetle, they're not really the same. Japanese beetle is much more of an ornamental issue. However, it can cause kind of life-threatening effects on trees if it continues to defoliate the tree year after year. And so the tree on the right, again, it's totally defoliated. Linden is an absolute favorite of this pest, and so those are the trees that generally do get defoliated year after year. In my area, certainly your area, you might have different species, but you probably know which ones are the favorites, and the ones that get totally defoliated, you know, that causes them some problem. That puts the stress on the tree, whereas a minor feeding on a crabapple like that one on the left is not going to cause a life-threatening issue, but it is quite an ornamental issue that if you're dealing with customers or public in general, that they might have a problem with the threshold of damage that's on that tree, and so at that point you might choose to perform some kind of control on that. Again, wide host range. Some of the favorite trees are linden, birch, crabapple, Norway maple, any kind of fruit tree, just about, they really like. I've seen them feed on just about every species if forced, though. I've seen a tamarack tree, which is kind of rare to see, but I've seen that totally defoliated by Japanese beetle in rare instances. And ornamentals that they favor are roses and grapevines, clematis, a lot of the flowering plants that we have in our gardens. And they also love a lot of crop plants. And so if you have a vegetable garden, or certainly agriculture industry is very worried about this because they love soybeans. And so if they skeletonize soybeans and that plant can't produce the food, it's not going to fill its pods, and it costs quite a bit of money. That's the economic threshold for agriculture to treat. So we reach these economic thresholds or just aesthetic thresholds where we decide that we need to manage it through treatment of some kind. So the adult Japanese beetle treatments are the same as kind of the larval stages. I am going to have a little more information on those though. So cultural, certainly you want to keep your plants healthy by keeping them irrigated, watered. They're not going to totally be eliminated. The feeding is not going to be eliminated. However, it won't cause as much substantial damage to that tree if it's healthy to begin with. And so that's certainly a practice that we can all recommend to our customers. Keep your plants healthy. I've got a photo of Nutriroot there. That's a type of a soil improver that doesn't necessarily push growth through high nitrogen, which is attractive to insects like Japanese beetles. So it keeps the plant healthy, builds a strong root system, makes it more able to cope with stresses such as this. And so that's one method. Mechanical, and if you've ever seen the numerous traps that are on the market, if people have their a trap on their deck, for example. Basically, it's a funnel that has a pheromone that the insect is attracted to. The Japanese beetles come flying towards it. And then they are a bit of a clumsy flyer, so they get caught into this funnel, and then they can't get out. And so these things fill up pretty fast. And I've had several people joke that if you've got Japanese beetle traps all around your property, that you're just basically attracting them to your property to feed on the plants, because they just can't all fit in the traps. They can fill up so fast. But lots of those traps on the market. Certainly they're good for monitoring at the beginning of the season if you want to determine how many Japanese beetles are in the area. If you've got that thing out and by the July 10th or so you haven't hardly gotten a beetle in there, it's not going to be a bad year. So that's where they're really beneficial, the traps, just to kind of monitor to see if you're going to need to control it this year. But as a control measure, I think they're kind of limited in their scope. There's biological control, excuse me, and chemical control. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the chemical control, the challenges we face when we're treating a pest like Japanese beetle, and then some options that we have. Excuse me. So treatment considerations. So Japanese beetles feed on many flowering plants. So linden tree is one example. Rose bushes are another example. A lot of the perennials that are in our gardens are examples. So they feed on a lot of plants when they're flowering, and they may feed on the flower itself, or they may feed on the foliage, skeletonizing that. But we also know that the other things that visit flowering plants are pollinators, and so we're caught in kind of a catch-22 as to how to protect the plant from damage, that aesthetic damage that we don't want, or life-threatening damage if it's defoliating trees year after year. And then we have to balance that with our need to protect our pollinators, which are a valuable resource as well. And so they're helping to produce food for us. And so the EPA in the last several years has gotten a little tighter on restrictions for treating flowering plants. And so they call that the EPA Bee Advisory Box, which is on most pesticide labels at this point. And the main reason is that we want to be real conscious to not treat flowering plants when pollinators might be visiting them. And so there was a story probably, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago now, out west, where an applicator treated plants that were in flower. They were basically linden trees that were in flower, and it was over a parking lot, and there were thousands and thousands of bees that visited those flowers died. And so that really raised awareness. It also makes us, as applicators, we have to be very conscious of that. And so we know that people are watching, and we know that what we do can affect the rest of the environment. And so we got to be very, very cautious and careful and make sure we're doing the right thing. And so we want to choose a treatment with minimal environmental exposure and minimal risk towards causing harm to pollinators. And so when you look at the methods of application for most problems that we deal with, there are contact sprays. Basically, that's where we spray a plant and it has an insecticide in it. And contact means that if that insecticide comes in contact with the insect, that'll take care of that problem. The limitations are certainly height. When we're spraying trees, it's very difficult to spray tall trees, and there's overspray is common. I've sprayed a lot of trees, and I know that happens. So the other thing is that we need to get full coverage to get the control that we want, and certainly there is off-target effects when we're spraying trees. Soil drench and injection requires time to reach the target. So we'll get back to that flowering plant example. We know that soil treatments take 6 to 8 weeks to move from the soil. Let's use soil applied imidacloprid. From 6 to 8 weeks from the time we do a soil treatment till the time it is up in the canopy protecting that tree means that it's going to be applied during the flowering period. And so that limits our ability to utilize that product. We also know that there is a potential for off-target effects, meaning if we're trying to treat one tree, there may be other roots in that area that pick up that product as well from flowering plants. And so there is a higher potential for off-target effects on that. Basal bark spray, also the same kind of thing, that there is a potential for off-target effects. Tree injection is the most rapid response of these treatments. Well, not any more rapid than spraying, but it is a very rapid response in comparison to a soil treatment. There are limited off-target effects, meaning that we are targeting that one particular plant with a small dose of pesticide and sealing it inside that tree. And so that does minimize our risk of off-target effects. And then we can target the right amount of product because we're not having any kind of drift issues. So we're targeting that dose exactly for that problem and limiting off-target effects. So we feel that that is the most targeted approach towards this pest. And so then we just kind of have to know what the flowering cycles of these plants are when we're doing a trunk injection. Just go back to the soil treatments. Again, they must be done well in advance. It is the most common homeowner treatment. I know you are professionals if you're listening to this, possibly some homeowners, but you as a professional have a leg up on that homeowner because you know your products, you're licensed to apply them, and you know how much to put on, when to put it on, and so, but the homeowners oftentimes are going into the garden center and purchasing something with good intentions. However, they need to use it right. And one new thing with the whole new B label on the EPA restrictions is that some of these products now, the soil applied imidacloprids, are you're no longer able to treat linden trees, Tilia species. And that's the main reason is that flowering cycle, and they are so attractive to bees. So you want to look at that pesticide label, and you'll find that many of them now prohibit the usage on that kind of plant. There's also per acre limits and off-target effects, as I mentioned. So just picking out lindens, for example, again, there's lots of plants that flower that Japanese beetle is attractive to, but I can't talk about them all. So I'll just focus on linden because it is a real favorite of that pest, and especially in the Midwest and I would say mid-Atlantic. And they flower in mid-June. Generally speaking, they're flowering from, I just looked at some lindens the other day, and the flower clusters are all there, but they aren't quite broken open yet. So they're going to break open here fairly soon, and then they're going to flower. And generally speaking, they're done flowering by the third week in June. Every year is going to be a little different, and so you do have to do visual observations to see where they're at. But you want to look for those little clusters of flowers or whatever plant that you're dealing with. And at that point, you do not want to treat. And so right on our label for one of our products that we use for Japanese beetle is Ima-jet, and right on the label it says do not apply to flowering plants. And most pesticides will have that kind of information on them. And so what we do is we wait until that flowering cycle is done. And we know because we're doing a trunk injection that it moves up into that tree rapidly. So once the flowering is done, I have some time before Japanese beetle emergence to get out there and do a trunk injection of that tree and not affect the flowers. With the right product, we know that the residual is going to be short enough that product will not be in that tree the following year. And so by missing that flowering cycle, we're protecting the pollinators because they won't be visiting that plant once they're done flowering, and then we can go ahead and treat. Again, we do have two products, actually three products, but we have two synthetic products that we can do trunk injections for Japanese beetle. One is Ima-jet. It is Imidacloprid, but it is targeted into the tree, again, after flowering. And the other is Azasol, and that product is a great, fast-moving product that provides a little bit shorter control. But if the pest is already active, that would be the product that I would recommend because it moves up quickly and affects that pest quickly. But either product will affect Japanese beetle. I do like Ima-jet for season-long control. Again, I've got that Azasol fast-acting, and then it will control Japanese beetle for about a month. And so if you're applying, say, after Japanese beetle emerges, you are going to have good control for up to 30 days, if not a little bit longer. But Ima-jet will provide that extended entire season-long control. And it's very, very effective. I've had many, many applicators that have used it over the years with great success on an annual basis. And so where I get a lot of folks that are interested in treating trees are in municipalities or large kind of complexes like golf courses, things like that, where there are a lot of lindens or birches that they're attracted to, and they get defoliated year after year. And so that's where a treatment program exists, and so we know that it works really, really well for a year. But there's also a lot of research that we've done on this, and as you can see, you can keep the leaves very, very clean with Ima-jet. We also have a non-synthetic insect control option, which is called Azasol. Azasol is 6% azadirachtin. It is very water soluble, and it acts as an anti-feedant and insect growth regulator. So it's at Arborjet, we are concerned that we want to make sure that we're applying treatments in the most environmentally responsible way, and that's why we developed this product, because we know that azadirachtin is a very good insect growth regulator and anti-feedant. It's derived from the neem tree, and neem we know is a natural insecticide. In other words, if a plague of locusts were flying through India where neem trees grow, they would eat everything but the neem tree, and so they just are not attracted to that. And so we derive the active ingredient from that tree, and it provides an excellent anti-feedant and insect growth regulator opportunity for us. Low toxicity in mammals, in fact, it's OMRI listed, and it's a neonicotinoid alternative. 0 days to harvest, so you can apply in your garden. And then it is also labeled for spray, injection, or drench. So it depends on what kind of plant material you're going to treat. If, for example, you're treating perennials or small ornamentals, a spray application is recommended. One thing that you do need to do is spray fairly often. The effects are probably 7 to 10 days, so you need to monitor for that insect, the Japanese beetle. Make sure that you're starting when the insect is starting to come out, starting to emerge, and start your program at that point, and then retreat every 7 to 10 days, and you're going to find excellent control. As a spray for small plant material, but you can also do a trunk injection with this if you desired. You are going to get about 30 days control through trunk injection as well. And again, we've done research on Japanese beetles specifically with Azasol, and as you can see, you can get excellent control as an anti-feedant, insect growth regulator. And I've been asked by pollinator folks about the effect on bees with Azasol, and because it is such an effective anti-feedant, that bees do not visit it either. And so it is a good alternative to those other synthetic treatments if you are treating plant material that you're highly concerned about those types of pollinators visiting, that kind of thing. So really effective. I love Azasol on Japanese beetle, but you do need to know that you do need to reapply fairly often. It is translaminar, meaning that it will move through the leaf, so you don't have to get the contact coverage on the bottom and the top of the leaf, but rather it will move through the leaf, so effective in that way too. And again, I said it's real water soluble, which is good for you if you are going to mix that. It stays in solution really well and moves and sprays quite easily. So again, all these pictures are different Japanese beetle research plots. Very good control with Azasol. So in summary, for adult control of Japanese beetle, you want to monitor. So know when those insects are beginning to emerge from the soil, which is either now in the south or very soon in the upper Midwest. Know that they're going to be doing their damage for the next 2 months at that point from the time they emerge. And then choose your treatment based on the plant material that you're treating. If it's a tree, individual trees, we can definitely do trunk injection on trees that are not in flower with Ima-jet or Ace-jet. For example, birch, lindens I specified because they do flower in June, but there's many plants that flower much earlier, say crab apples or birch that Japanese beetle is attracted to. So in those cases, we don't have to wait until the end of June to treat. We can go ahead and use Ima-jet, this time of the year or even earlier and get those trees treated. But the trees that are in flower, we do want to wait till their flowering cycle is complete, and we can do the trunk injection with those. at that time. You can possibly inject Azasol to create that anti-feeding effect on those flowering trees, but again, you know that your control isn't going to be as long with that product. And then we can treat our ornamentals with Azasol, but you want to do that in a spray treatment every 7 to 10 days. And so you're going to find good control with these methods of the adult insects. And again, I didn't get in depth into the larval stage, the grub stage of the insect. I know there's large turf managers that are very concerned about the damage that the grubs can cause in turf. One thing I will say on that note, though, is that just because you manage the grubs in your turf does not mean that you're not going to have adult insects causing damage to your ornamentals or trees, because they can fly some distance. And unless we're able to predict where all the larval, the grubs are causing damage and able to control those in all urban areas, we are going to have areas that aren't treated and where there is adult development, and then those adults are going to emerge and fly to other areas. And so it is a complex issue to manage both the turf and the ornamentals, but just because I manage my turf and contain the grubs in that in those areas does not mean I'm not going to have any ornamental issues. So that's the one thing I will say. But if you do want to get more information, you could certainly reach out to me and I could point you in the right direction for which grub controls are the most effective in the turf as well. I think that's about it. I know I was fairly brief and looking at 35, 40 minutes taken up of your time, but here's my contact information if you do have any questions. I do deal with Japanese beetle quite a bit. It's a real short season for us for Japanese beetle up here in Minnesota, but I guess you learn a lot about things like that in short season. So no matter where you're from, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I'm going to turn it over to Zach now, and if he wants me to open it up for questions, he certainly can.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Wonderful job. A lot of good information, especially about the pollinator situation. If anyone has questions, you can enter them into the chat line, which looks like the talk box from a comic strip, or if you want to ask it out loud, you can just write that you have a question. We can get you unmuted. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording.